horticulture. Now, my job today is to convince you that horticulture is a adaptation which involves a lot of human creativity and imagination, a very ingenious adaptation, involves a ton of knowledge about your environment, what kinds of things can grow, experimentation with various forms of seeds and cuttings and clippings and grafting. It's a really cool thing that people have done. It has also enabled many political, cultural developments that we see in the world. Talk about different forms of life that are possible because of this small scale gardening or large over a large area, but little plantings. It's also been a strategy which has been quite successful in terms of being able to be used in many different environments. And in most cases, like other things, this sort of depends on whether people are hooked up into the market economy or not. But in most cases, it's a pretty sustainable way to support households, even pretty large populations. And I would say that I think that although we may need, of course, if we are going to feed lots and lots of people, that we may need more intensive forms of agriculture. But the horticultural activities are something that you can learn from already. Now, I know it's pretty early in the morning, but you're probably thinking, wait a second, this sounds like something that guy said last time we were here. Are you thinking that? You should be, because it sounds a lot like what I said about foraging, doesn't it? Hunting and gathering. It's almost the same exact thing. Now, I believe that the reason I'm saying it's kind of successful, sustainable, enables a lot of things, and is ingenious, and that we can learn from it is it's all those things that are all kind of true. However, what I think is different in some ways about foraging and horticulture in terms of what we have to argue against is that in the last class, in terms of hunting and gathering, I was saying that we had to argue against the idea that that was some sort of natural baseline human nature economy, or maybe they were just like wild animals pursuing wild plants and wild game, and so they didn't have culture at all. With horticulture, I probably don't need to convince you or anyone as much that it is a cultural adaptation, because there it is right in the name, horticulture. In fact, I think what I want to argue most against here is this idea that when horticulture comes, when people start domesticating plants, plant domestication especially, that it was some sort of watershed event in human history. Now, in your textbook, they every so often, I would say, slip back into this kind of watershed type language. Maybe we need to know what a watershed is. Yeah, what is a watershed? Let's say there's a watershed in human history, or watershed. What does that mean? That's a good ecological term. When somebody says, this is the watershed. Oh boy. Well, we better do this then. A watershed is like the place on a mountain range where it's like if the water flows one direction, it's going all the way to the ocean on the east. And if the flows in the other direction, it's going all the way into the west. And so it starts in a small place. There's no real differentiation. But if it starts going one way, it's going to end up way far away. If it starts going the other way, it's in the other direction. So when people say this is a watershed event, it's like it's something that changes everything. Now, what I'm going to be arguing is that it didn't change everything. It's not the point just domesticating plants is not when all of human life got changed. So they make the statement on page 103 that this is the time that history in one sense begins. And I say that's baloney, that people were already historical before they domesticated plants. That's not necessarily a beginning or an ending of history. That's a pretty strange statement to make. It is also not when this point that humans sort of rise out of nature and start to control it. Again, they slip up a little bit in their language here, the idea that somehow people are now in control of these plants and animals. The other thing I'm arguing against here is that it doesn't automatically displace the hunting and gathering. Simply domesticating, working with domesticated plants and animals, the hunters and gatherers didn't all just fall down and start worshiping and converting into the new horticultural regime. I will also say that it does not inevitably become intensive agriculture. That is to say, people keep doing horticulture and they keep doing this domestic plant and animal thing without necessarily intensifying it. And so, to get to another point in which there's this little kind of, I think, slip here, or slippage in their language, the language of Bates, Tucker, and Losney, is this idea that the development of agriculture irrevocably affected the course of human cultural history. I think, Pluto, you quoted this. Why? Why did the development of agriculture irrevocably affect the course of human cultural history? There's that language. Now we remember, when we go back into the hunters and gatherers, we remember that they are able to have pretty large and sedentary populations. In the Pacific Northwest, we saw how they were able to have settled life and able to do lots of different things besides just get food. In fact, we remember that in certain studies, even in harsh environments like the Kalahari, they only had to work 10 to 15 hours per week of actually getting food. And the rest of the time, they were doing those all-night dances and talking and making things and being happy. So it's interesting. I agree that the development of agriculture is probably a hugely important development, and we'll be reading about that in the chapter 2 chapters away in intensive agriculture. But there's a little bit of a slippage here. We're not talking about agriculture yet. We're talking about just domesticating plants and animals and starting to do little farms and stuff like that. But this is not intensive agriculture. And so my feeling is that this is not really this kind of watershed event. People could have and still do maintain these kinds of small plots and shifting farms, and are often pretty nomadic while also being horticulturists. So we actually should know this from their own description of what horticulture is. So this is, like I said, we should be extremely aware that the idea that just because people started cultivating plants, cultivating animals in a slightly more intensive way, doesn't mean they automatically, there was some sort of crazy switch over. And so this is true today, and it certainly was true in the past. Even prehistoric hunter-gatherers often incorporate significant horticultural production into their adaptation. So people who were mostly hunting and gathering, and we would call hunters and gatherers, would also be doing some planting, right? Just as predominantly farm-supported populations, so people who were mostly farming, were also foraging, and hunting. Today, for people who we classify as farmers, and it's true today for people that we classify as hunter-gatherers. The point is that often these people are mixing these things together, and whether we designate them as hunters and gatherers or whether we designate them as farmers is really kind of dependent on how much, the percentage of stuff, but a lot of people are mixing these things together. It's also important for us to realize that there were lots of people in the world who saw their neighbors and saw that they were cultivating stuff, and they said, we don't want to do that. We know you could do that, but we're not going to do that. And so the idea that it was simply a complete advantage to shift to horticulture is not supported in the evidence. Now, why did they not want to do it? Is because oftentimes when you're farming, you have to work harder. So it makes you longer hours. And as they say, there are times that when you are dependent on one crop or another, it gives you less diversity in your diet. You become less mobile, which is often a health benefit. And so not always, I don't want to be overly down on the farmers and the horticulturists, but in some cases, the health levels decrease, and we can see that in the skeletons and people's average height and nutrition levels during prehistoric times and also during historic times as people transition on to what we know of as more modern diets. The other interesting thing is that some of these early agriculturalists, these early farmers, they would set up their farms and they would get all intense and plant things. And then they seem to have, at least in this box, and they seem to have died. We don't know why exactly, but then the next thing we know, they're in like big mass graves. Now, whether that's because they got into a fight with somebody or because they simply didn't make it in these areas, but there were some places where people tried to do agriculture and just didn't work. So it was mixed in the past, and I would say that going up to right now, when people are still doing what we might call gardening or horticulture, it's still more, in some ways, more like hunting and gathering, and it is a low energy budget strategy. And so they talk about it has a relatively low yield per acre of land. It's something that people do. It's not the same as intensive agriculture or what would develop as plantation agriculture. You're not trying to necessarily take as much as possible to increase your yield from the land. So I just want to be clear here that both hunting and gathering and horticulture are these strategies of procurement of food, which tend to be, there's a lot of intermixing, and they tend to be pretty sustainable over time. And there's not necessarily a clear ascent from one to the other. Now, one of the things that we're talking about, of course, when we talk about horticulture is that plants and animals have been domesticated. They have come into the sphere of human involvement. And, people, there's been a big question as to how and why this happened. From what I have settled upon or what I've read most recently is I like to think about domestication as opening up new interactions between humans, plants, and animals. It's not so much that human beings are in control of these interactions, but it does open up new and different possibilities, way of working with both plants and animals more intensively, you might say. And so it also changes the relationship between the plants and the animals that people are working with. And these plants and animals start to co-evolve with humans, and they become dependent upon each other. So many of the varieties of domesticated plants they often arise from genetic mutations which are favorable to human cultivation. So that wheat, for example, in its domesticated form does not disperse as widely as it would in its wild form. Now that's good for human beings. If you're trying to harvest this wheat, you don't want it dispersing everywhere, but it would not be as good for wheat in the wild to not be able to disperse. So this opens up the possibility that different plants and animals become dependent upon human beings for their own reproduction, but human beings also become quite dependent on those plants and animals. There's been a big question about how deliberate it was. Kind of the garbage dump or the trash heap idea, like you're eating stuff, it's coming out in different ways, you're throwing it away, and then you're like, oh my God, there they are, plants again, yay. Now, I think that this is probably true. I mean, in some senses, there's a truth to it. I guess I would say that in some ways also, though, that for hunters and gatherers and any human beings, they were extremely attentive to their environment, and they already knew that plants grew from seeds. So I guess I would stress here that although there were definitely there were subconscious elements and accidents and things like that, but there was also definitely people being conscious and knowledgeable about what is going on. By the way, in most societies, who are the people who most know about plants, things you do with plant fibers, and weaving, and plant knowledge, growing things? Huh? Women do, that's right. Very important. And so these attempts of these guys to say, it was just a bunch of trash and they didn't even know what they were doing. You have to watch out for these guys because it's often the women who had this plant knowledge, and they were probably the ones who were most interested in, as we saw in the last class, basketry and textiles and things. On the other hand, this is not going to be again, this is not just some overnight thing. It's a slow process. As they say, there's lots of accidents. It's, there's different things that go on. It's not just the light bulb moment that people see often in the world. Now, that said, it is very difficult. It's very difficult to shake the idea that there was some sort of revolution or watershed or a light bulb went off, a discovery, a big burst of things that happened. So, why is it so hard to shake these ideas? Because we love to believe in the genius of certain, of certain inventors or things like that. And we like the idea of a revolution is much more exciting in history. So, for example, I think this was, Pluto, one of your sentences to talk more about. There is this idea that, wait a second, we have Homo sapiens who seem to be anatomically modern, maybe 200,000 years ago, but then they don't become like, mentally modern, you might say, until about 20 or 30,000 years ago, or 15,000 years ago. And so this has often been a thing that is debated in anthropology, like, well, what's the reason for this difference? And people have suggested that there is some sort of genetic mutation and all of a sudden language comes, or all of a sudden, somehow some big event happens. Now, like I said, I'm going to argue against that. There's a number of reasons that this seems to have been, the more we do our research, it seems to have been kind of a mirage or a false idea that there were two different processes. For one thing, archaeologists, were often concentrating their efforts on places that were near to them, often in European areas, looking for things like King Arthur's sword and stuff like that. And so the more we got out of, or the more we are able to get out of kind of European-centered archaeology, we're seeing that there are a lot of these things that seem to burst on the scene in Europe that were actually gradually developing in Africa. Even things like they mentioned earlier in the book the cave art that appears in what is now France and Spain. It appears in other places as well, such as Indonesia. So it seems to be more of a global thing and more of a gradual thing. The other thing we talked about in the last class, and that's when I was showing you all those pictures of different hunter-gatherer structures and artistic work, is that there were places that where hunters and gatherers would gather in or assemble in dense populations. They might not have lived there. Those might have been seasonal things. But again, the archaeology hasn't been there to sort of figure that out. And so, there's this idea that, like I said, has been prominent that people were only able to be sedentary and create art and have political hierarchy and these kinds of monuments once they had agriculture. I think we're discovering more and more that that is not necessarily the case, and you can do that with hunting and gathering. There's also one more little factor, speaking of how cold it is that, before about 12 to 15,000 years ago, there was that little thing, that little ice age, which is a pretty big ice age. And so a lot of the things that people might have been able to do with domesticating, especially plants, were not available because of the climate, basically. So there was a warming period, which we call the Holocene. And during this warming period, there were lots of different places where people did domestication. And so in your textbook on page 103, they called plant domestication a human global achievement. And in Melinda Zeter's work, she talks about these areas of the world which are basically not necessarily connected to each other. So we know the most about the domestication that happened in what is called the Fertile Crescent or the Middle East, where we see some of those big crops like wheat and animals like cows. But, there's independent domestication going on of, say, potatoes here, turkeys in the Southwest, turkeys also here, and of course maize or corn. Same in the Northeast, we had up here, we had some sunflowers being domesticated. Across Northern Africa, rice over in, so we have, and the bananas over here. So we have all of these areas, and it's not going to be one single process in all of these areas. There's going to be variations on what people do with these things. And it's only over time, slowly, that people would join up and combine things from these different areas of the world. So there are some, what I would call, possible consequences of adapting domesticated plants and animals and intensifying your production of food. One of those is that you can support more people. And so, it is, as we talked about, there were areas of the world in which hunters and gatherers were able to congregate in seasonal times in greater numbers and be sedentary before there was horticulture. But obviously, if you can plant things around your village, it enables you to have this kind of more settled life and a more concentrated cultural society. In general, when, and again, this is not always true of all horticultural forms, but people sometimes get dependent on one particular crop, especially if it's a high calorie crop like a corn or a potato or a rice, where you can increase the quantity of that, the amount that you're producing, but you're often decreasing the quality of your overall nutrition. And this is one reason why people are getting into things like the paleo diet now, is because in general, those diets were more diverse than you see under horticulture, but especially agriculture. We talked about how doing horticulture often increases your labor requirements. So you have to spend more time, or at least certain people have to spend more time. Other people might not be doing this at all, but certain people are having to spend more time. It can also, first of all, the plants and animals themselves, if they are concentrated like this, can be susceptible to diseases, but also close association, especially with domesticated animals, and then increasing your population can make people more susceptible to disease. I guess we kind of figured that one out in the last few years, but this is also true of various flus that would come in from domesticated animals and things like smallpox, and you know, they spread often through contact with domesticated plants and animals and then into more denser human populations. Again, these are possible, they're not inevitable, and they're not found in all horticultural societies. I want to talk a little bit about what is called swidden agriculture. Or that's a contemporary picture. It is also known as slash and burn agriculture. So basically, what you do is you take an area of a forest and cut parts of it down, burn that part so it increases your land area for horticulture or agriculture use, and sometimes increases the nutrient levels in the soil, and then you plant things. Now, although it has a bad rap and it kind of looks yucky when you do it, slashing and burning and creates fire. But if it's done in many of the places where this has been done traditionally, it can be a quite sustainable system. So people would move from different plots, and you'd only cultivate them for a certain amount of time, and then you'd allow the forest and other trees to regrow. And so you'd be, in some ways, not exactly nomadic, but moving around every 10 to 15 years. And in many places, the forests that have been cultivated by slash and burn agriculture, swidden agriculture, look like untended forests, but are actually the product of human involvement and human activity. Now, in today's world, and in certain times when if your people are giving you money for stuff, in the same ways that sometimes hunter-gatherer groups that are drawn into a larger market economy for furs or for other for meat, can overuse their environment. If people are paying you for this, for certain crops, and you're growing them for cash, it can be an element of deforestation. So it's one of those things that it can be a good technique in certain environments, but it is also susceptible to this to becoming part of deforestation in certain areas. On the whole, though, if you're practicing horticulture, this sort of small scale, low energy budget, it's usually a small scale activity which is sustainable. The point of this, oftentimes, like I said, we think of plant and animal domestication, we jump straight into agriculture, and we think of it as this huge alteration of the natural world and the natural environment. And what they are saying here is that oftentimes what people are doing is simply taking things out of their environment and concentrating them in a certain area. And so a canny imitation of the forest. So they're trying to, in some ways, grow things more closely that might have been more dispersed in their ecosystem. And I say that as a lead-in into how most horticulturalists tend to view the world. And in this sense, I'm drawing upon a book that I used to assign for this class by Tim Ingold called The Perception of the Environment. And for somehow in the old days, we read both that book and this textbook at the same time. I don't know how that happened, but I was probably meaner back then. So Ingold uses various ethnographic examples to talk about how most of the people who are doing this horticulture do not see themselves the way that they've often been portrayed as people who are controlling nature or people who are somehow above and beyond and imposing social norms upon the natural world. They don't see themselves as doing this hyper-controlled activity of intervening in the reproductive cycle of other animals and plants. Rather, what they see it as is that what they are doing is setting up conditions for how plants and animals grow. And so they see the growth process as something that is natural, that they are simply tending to the growth process and making it easier for the plants and animals to grow. And they compare it mostly to raising children, the way that you would help to create the conditions of growth for your own children. And we talked about how oftentimes plant knowledge is something that women do in these societies. And in a similar way, the idea of cultivating or creating the conditions for growth for kids. Now, we talked about this. We talked about how in hunter and gatherer societies, they often see the relationship between the plants and animals that they are hunting and gathering as one of reciprocity, of a give and take. And this is a slightly different relationship, the childhood, the children and parent relationship. I want to specify, though, that the way that they see themselves as raising children is not the way that some people in our own society see this, or as I used to see this. So I used to see that that children started off as these weird creatures who needed to be shaped and civilized. But they don't see it that way. They see it as simply the parents set up the conditions in which the kids can grow up and grow into social maturity. So in the same way that we talked about the hunters and gatherers didn't see necessarily the plants and animals that they were hunting and gathering as somehow wild or separate from the human world, they saw them as part of the household. People in most horticultural societies do not draw a huge line between those animals and plants that are domesticated and those that are out in the forest. And there are some plants and animals like hogs, or pigs, for example, in certain places. Some of them are out in the forest roaming around, and some of them are closer to home and tended by humans. And so the difference here between what counts as a domesticate is simply the degree to which human beings are setting up the conditions for how it grows. And so there are things that some people consider weeds that might be useful and cultivated in other societies. It just depends on how humans are cultivating these things. So again, what I've been trying to argue here is we have a pretty cool way of dealing with the world and working within it. But it is not necessarily the thing that led to the environmental crisis that we see today. At the end of this chapter, as they like to do, they give us two ethnographic examples. They start with the Yanomamo. I have to say, it's not that I hate the Yanomamo, but I do hate the example of the Yanomamo because it's so controversial and complicated, in part because the main person who first, as an anthropologist, studied them, and they talk about this person, Napoleon Chagnon, was a pretty, how to say, he was an outsized figure. He was a very dynamic figure. And he wrote a book, he portrayed them as the fierce people. And this book became almost, if you were going to take, say, an anthropology class in high school, this would be the book that you read if you were growing up in the 70s. Yanomamo, the fierce people. Now, just imagine yourself being in high school, early college, an impressionable person, and you read about the Yanomamo, and your first thing you read about is almost all of you got really excited about this female infanticide, or oh, whoa, yeah, this would be eye-catching. A woman, blah, blah, blah. If despite the taboo, a woman does become pregnant while she is still nursing her last child, she will kill the new baby rather than deprive the older child of milk. A woman is also likely to kill her first baby if it is a girl, for her husband, of course, wants a son. Yeah, that would grab your attention. That sucks, right? That's a terrible thing. And this is the kind of language that he would use to describe. And so people would just be reading this in their high school class and think, oh, yeah, that's what other people are like. Don't want to be like them. Glad I'm here in this wonderful high school instead of off with the Yanomamo. Now, I guess I would say that, they're probably not, they probably do some of this, but there have been other people who've examined them and say, I don't know if they're as fierce as Napoleon Chagnon describes, throughout their groups. They don't seem necessarily to be as bad as that. And I would also say that there are many horticultural groups in the world who, treat their kids completely nice. They were horrified when they found out that in Western societies you would they would spank or slap your kid or do something like that. They would say that that would be appalling, that you would never do that. So there was a question about, to what extent was this simply a representation of the Yanomamo? And the other debate was, if they are fierce and if there are these high levels of violence between groups and within the groups, what accounts for those? Now, Chagnon wanted to claim that it was basically evolution. And, I don't want to get into all the specifics of this debate, but he was in some ways trying to make it out that this was representative of a certain stage of human evolution or a certain possibility of human evolution, and it was just going to be this way, and that's the way people were like. Other people, like the anthropologist Brian Ferguson, and it's a perspective that I much more associate with, is he wasn't saying that it was that their activities were entirely a product of colonialism, but he was saying you cannot understand what happened and what the Yanomamo were like without understanding that a lot of them had been displaced from their traditional lands, that they'd been concentrated in areas because of what had happened in Brazil and Venezuela. They had to move out of different places, and they had to defend themselves against various raids and gold mining and different kinds of expeditions. And they were also in competition for trade goods. And so this idea that they were simply kind of doing this evolutionary thing without talking about the influence of both
colonialism in terms of bringing in different weapons and different kinds of trade goods, and also colonialism in terms of displacing people from their habitats, was not exactly the best thing to do. After that, there was also this huge uproar. Chagnon became the subject of basically of an investigation. People accused him of, letting a smallpox epidemic spread without providing vaccinations. I think that accusation was wrong, but it got into all these kind of uproars. He's still an extremely controversial figure within anthropology. If you want to get in a fight with an anthropologist, then talk about this for a while. So I'm not excited about this example because I think I don't think it's a great example of what horticulture is like. It's an example of what people have been fighting about. I did like one part about that, the part where they talked about the right to self-isolate. And one of the things they bring up in this section is that there are some groups who know, it's not that they don't know what's out there. It's not that they have never been contacted. It's not that they are truly isolated. And in fact, as they put it, no population is truly uncontacted. And they are probably maintaining or they are definitely maintaining trade and interaction with their neighboring groups, but they want to remain isolated from what we might call Western contact. So they want to choose non-contact with, groups like missionaries and traders. And, there's not a lot of groups like that. And they're not truly isolated or uncontacted. But as they put it here, it is a human right to a basic human, should be respected as a basic human right to self-isolate if they don't want to contact. So there seem to be some Yanomamo who are choosing to not contact with the Western world. In the last part of the chapter, they talk about the Pueblo of North America. I was thinking about it. This would be a great paper topic, the banana. So you could do one on this. What's so interesting about the banana, Liv?
It's like it originally wasn't that edible.
Well, many plants weren't that edible, and people had to figure out how to deal with them. Some things were like poisonous, and people figured out that if you cooked it, then cooked it in a certain way, then you could eat it. But I wonder how they figured that out. They had to be smart, or people just experimented on other people. But yes, it originally wasn't edible. Pluto, how did they make it edible? How did they do it? Cloned. It's weird. Yeah, they cloned them. So you don't plant them by seed. If you try to plant them by seed, it's not going to work. But they figured out that you could take shoots from the other one and you can clone them. Now, this is really cool. And it does point to the fact that people are smart. And they figured this out, and there's deliberate activity. And in all parts of the world, people, mess around with plants and animals and figure out these things. In the modern world, however, it is potentially a problem because we have all these banana clones running around, and if a disease comes through, it just rips through them. And so we might not have any bananas anymore if we don't watch out. And it's partly because they're clones, but it's also because they're often grown in like these intensive plantations. And so if you're just growing bananas for yourself in a horticultural type system, you might be using clones, but you have some different varieties. But basically the concentrated system on which we've built intensive agriculture, and especially plantation agriculture of bananas, is dangerous in the sense that diseases and stuff can just rip through them. So this would be a great paper, I